Engines hummed across the continents. From desert to jungle, snowfield to shoreline, the sound was the same, a low, steady growl, a heartbeat of steel and oil beneath the open sky. In North Africa, jeeps carved trails through sand and heat. In Normandy, they rolled between hedgerows slick with rain. In the Pacific, they waded through mud and salt water, canvas flapping. Everywhere the Allies advanced, that sound followed, tireless, unbreakable, no music, only engines, and the shuffle of boots. Men rode with sleeves rolled, goggles dusted white. Chaplains, medics, generals, and messengers shared the same four wheels. The little machine that moved an army. The one no one believed would matter. Years earlier, it had been nothing. A sketch on a workbench. A problem the Army scarcely wanted to solve. Records show the specification arrived in July 1940. A light reconnaissance car, four-wheel drive, under 100 pounds. 49 days to deliver a prototype from scratch. Even some generals laughed. They called it a toy, a truck for parades. They doubted any small firm could meet the demand. The world was already changing faster than their doubts. Wind rose across the test field, and engines thinned to an echo. Silence gathered over wet ground and sagging tarps. Camp Holabird, Maryland, autumn 1940. Mud sucked at boots as men studied square, stubborn machines. Colonel Oseth walked to the Bantam car, gloved hands tucked tight. "Too small," someone muttered, breath white in the air. The driver climbed in. The engine coughed, then caught in a gray puff. It lurched forward, struck a rut, and leapt free. Faces changed, mouths closed. For the first time, the Army saw something new. A vehicle that climbed, twisted, and pulled through anything. It could turn on a dime and vanish into trees. A test driver shouted into the wind, "This thing goes anywhere!" No clerk wrote the line, yet the moment held. Skepticism loosened, and the road ahead opened. By late 1941, more than 100 prototypes had run trials. The Willys MB, hardened and fitted with the Go Devil engine, won. Ford joined production with matching frames and parts. Together they would build over 600,000 Jeeps before war's end. But in 1940 it remained a gamble. Factories shaved ounces from frames and bolts from chassis. Each cut traded comfort for survival. Winter froze engines in Maryland's cold. Lanterns hissed while mechanics bled from cracked fingers. An engineer wrote home, "We're building a mule made of steel. It wasn't built to impress. It was built to endure." The first shipment left under a slate sky. Wooden crates marked recon car swayed in the dark hold. Somewhere between waves, a loose bolt ticked in its crate. A small heartbeat inside a larger one. North Africa, 1942, answered with wind and heat. Engines strained while sand erased every track behind them. The same little Jeep carried commanders across open battle lines. Patton braced on a windshield frame, goggles lifted high. Montgomery stood beside another, maps flapping against the hood. The laughter of 1940 had vanished into sand and smoke. In the Pacific, Marines called it the faithful servant. In Italy, stretchers were wired along the sides for wounded. In France, chaplains laid bread and wine across its hood. A GI said later, "It wasn't just a vehicle, it was part of us." When the war ended, some refused to leave it behind. Names clung to fenders, Lil Joe, Faithful, Liberty Bell. A few drove theirs into surf rather than watch them rust. Its afterlife began not as a weapon, but as a witness. Engines faded into quiet, wheels slowed on wet ground. The war had turned, yet the story had just begun. A single Jeep idled in rain, headlights dimming to silver. Water dripped from the hood and pooled around its tires. Silence held the frame a beat longer. Then a voice, soft and steady, returned. They laughed at it once. It carried armies, prayers, and memories across continents. Before the world could forget its sound, another front would rise. Factories trembled with noise, but in one corner there was only paper and silence. A handful of men bent over blueprints, cigarettes burning low beside rulers and wrenches. Drafting lamps glowed like small suns against the gloom of midnight steel. They were engineers, not soldiers. Their front line was a table, their weapon, a pencil sharpened to exhaustion. They had 49 days. Every inch, every bolt had to count. The War Department's order was clear: a reconnaissance car that could climb 45 degrees, carry 3 men, and pull a machine gun through mud, all under 1,300 pounds. Impossible, that's what they said. But still they drew, measured, erased, began again. Outside, the foundries howled. Inside, only the scratch of graphite on vellum. One man murmured, "We're not building a car, we're building a chance." At dawn, the first frame took shape. Bare steel, short wheelbase, nothing wasted. An engine block small enough to hold between 2 hands. The Go Devil. It coughed to life on the 12th night, rattling every loose screw in the shop. Workers cheered, not for beauty, but for survival. They had built a heartbeat that could go anywhere. When the prototype reached Camp Holabird, Maryland, the mud was frozen solid. Officers in wool coats watched from the sidelines. They doubted it would move more than 50 yards. The driver turned the key. The Jeep lurched forward, splattering mud across the observer's boots. Then it climbed the test hill, slow, steady, unyielding. At the top, the engine idled in victory. One mechanic laughed through chattering teeth. "Guess it doesn't know it's small." Orders came within a week. 70 vehicles for field testing, then thousands more. Willys, Ford, and Bantam split the load. Factories burned light into the night, welding, bolting, shaping steel that would outlast men. Back in the drafting room, an engineer pinned a new note on the wall, 3 words in grease pencil: "It works anywhere." They didn't sign their names. They didn't have to. History would remember their work by sound alone. Engines roared across assembly lines, rivets sparked, paint guns hissed, and the air filled with oil and pride. It was no longer a sketch. It was a promise on 4 wheels, and soon it would leave American soil, bound for deserts, forests, and every place where men still hoped to move forward. Engines echoed against steel hulls. Crates marked recon car stacked high under gray light. Sailors moved between them, tightening chains, stamping manifests with gloved hands. The first convoy to war was quiet, no fanfare, only wind and salt water, and the smell of new paint mixed with oil. Each crate held a new idea of movement, a thing too small to be feared, but too stubborn to stop. They left Baltimore under cloud and rain. By the time the ships reached the Atlantic swells, the bolts inside those crates had already loosened from the rhythm of the sea. The first heartbeat of the war's most unlikely hero. When the holds opened weeks later in North Africa, heat struck like a blow. Engines groaned awake after their long sleep. Tarps came off, sand swept in. Men climbed behind the wheels, brushed grit from the dials, and turned the keys. The engines caught, coughed, and steadied. Soon, dust clouds rolled across the dunes. The first Allied rode on foreign ground. A corporal leaned from the passenger side, laughing through his scarf. "Feels like driving a tin can across hell," he shouted. But it moved. Through wadis, over rock, between ridge lines where trucks bogged down. Commanders took note. A small machine, half the size of a tank, could move maps, messages, and men faster than any armored column. Patton called them the shoes of the Army. Montgomery demanded hundreds for the desert campaign. Every division wanted more. They became ambulances, radio stations, machine gun nests, even mobile chapels. Whatever men needed, the Jeep became. Under the desert sun, the engines howled. At night, their headlights cut thin silver lines across the sand, the quiet geometry of survival. In those first campaigns, every road began and ended with the same sound, a low growl that meant the line was still moving. By the winter of 1942, the Jeep had proven what few machines ever do, that simplicity can become strategy. One driver wrote home, "I trust this thing more than I trust the sky." He was 19. The Jeep beneath him was 6 weeks old. Both would cross 3 continents before the war was done. When his unit reached the next port, they lined their Jeeps in formation for the first time, hundreds of them, square, weathered, alive. The wind carried their dust out to sea, where it met another convoy coming east. Engines on both sides of the ocean now spoke the same language. The age of slow war had ended. The world had begun to move. Engines groaned in the dark, salt spray against steel. An army of machines lashed to the decks of invasion ships, rocking with every swell. Each jeep stood silent, chains biting into its axles, tarps fluttering in the cold. Names were stenciled across their hoods: Betsy, Iron Mule, Moses, Lucky 7. Tiny letters for what had become the backbone of the Allied advance. Somewhere out there, the coast of Sicily waited behind the rain. When the first landing craft hit shore, the world dissolved into chaos. Waves breaking, engines choking on brine, sand, smoke, and the smell of cordite filled the air. Jeeps rolled off ramps like cattle through mud, their tires clawing at the surf. Men pushed from behind, boots slipping, helmets clanging, each one praying the engine would not drown. And somehow, most didn't. During Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, more than 3,000 jeeps landed with the first waves. Within hours, they were ferrying ammunition, medics, and officers up narrow mountain roads once built for mules. The mountains of Sicily were cruel: dust in daylight, fog at night, roads no wider than the jeep's own shadow. Engines strained, brakes screamed. Drivers leaned out windows with flashlights tied to their wrists, guiding convoys by inches. On one ridge, a jeep slipped. It slid sideways toward the ravine. 2 men leapt free, one stayed to steer. The vehicle rolled twice, then landed upright, engines still running. Someone below shouted, "Still alive!" The driver raised a thumb through the smoke. The jeep never stopped running. Neither did the man. By 1904, the little vehicle had crossed from myth to necessity. It was everywhere, from command posts to paratrooper drop zones. Welded, patched, repainted, repurposed. In Italy, it carried priests. In France, it carried generals. And in England, it waited by the tens of thousands for the day history would turn. Night fog over the English coast. Engines muted under canvas, rows upon rows of jeeps lined up on the docks, headlights blacked out, the smell of sea and fuel mixing in the mist. One mechanic adjusted a carburetor with a cigarette in his mouth. His hands shook from cold and nerves. He whispered, "Tomorrow she swims again." The sound of his lighter closing fades into waves slapping steel. June 6, 1904, Normandy, gray dawn over gray water. Landing craft grinding toward the beach. Gunfire distant, then near. Jeeps chained on deck, tarps already riddled with holes from shrapnel. When the ramps fell, men and machines went together. Some sank before touching sand. Some floated just long enough. Others roared free, climbing over bodies and wire. The scene was chaos, but the rhythm familiar. That same hum, that same pulse, carrying forward through fear. Sergeant David Hanlon, 29th Division, wrote in his pocket Bible, "This thing took me farther than fear ever could." The page was later found, torn and water-stained, inside a jeep abandoned near Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer. By nightfall, more than 2,000 jeeps had landed on the Normandy coast. They became ambulances, radio hubs, and gun platforms again. But more than anything, they became movement. A colonel at Omaha said it best: "If you saw dust moving, it was a jeep. If you saw hope moving, it was a jeep too." As the days passed, the beaches turned into roads. Roads turned into corridors of advance. The same little engines that once idled in American factories now echoed across hedgerows and villages, carrying the war east. Civilians waved as they passed, children offering apples, old women blessing the men with trembling hands. One soldier slowed to toss chocolate to a boy barefoot in the mud. The jeep lurched, then steadied. That single gesture, sugar through gunfire, was the kind of victory no headline ever recorded. Every theater had changed the jeep, but Normandy transformed it into legend. It no longer belonged to one army or nation. It was the shared language of liberation. Wherever it went, people followed. Behind it came supplies, letters, and news that the world might be turning toward light again. As the camera pulls back, rows of jeeps move inland under the summer haze. Dust rises, swallowing them one by one. The hum grows faint, replaced by distant thunder from the east, the next front calling. In the fields of Europe, the little machine became a messenger. It carried orders, courage, and silence in equal measure. It taught the armies of the world that strength need not be loud, only constant. Engines fade beneath the wind. Snow begins to fall. The hum deepens, shifting tone, a sign that winter, and the hardest road yet, is coming. Snow fell like ash across Belgium. The forest stood silent, white, endless. Engines coughed, sputtered, and kept breathing. Thin sound against thick cold. It was December 1904. The Allies thought the war was winding down. Then, without warning, the forest exploded with steel and flame. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. Convoys stalled under blizzards. Fuel froze in lines. Men walked beside their jeeps, kicking at ice between the treads. Everything slowed, except the enemy. In Bastogne, surrounded and cut off, the 101st Airborne Division held a shrinking perimeter. Their lifelines were engines no bigger than a dining table. Jeeps ran day and night, hauling shells, carrying wounded, dragging fuel drums through snowdrifts taller than men. Drivers tied rags over their faces, headlights dimmed, transmissions whining under frost. One officer wrote, "The Jeep is the only thing that still moves when everything else is dead." Wind shrieked through broken pines. Then, faintly, an engine refused to quit. Private Leonard Ortiz, age 20, leaned forward over the wheel, boots soaked through. He had been running ammunition to the front since dawn. Now the snow blinded him. Beside him, a wounded man in the back whispered the Lord's Prayer. Ortiz answered by tapping the horn twice, a signal that meant still alive. The Jeep hit a rut, bounced, slid, and somehow climbed back to the road. It didn't stop until the engine began to smoke. He left it there, still idling, still giving heat, while medics carried the wounded away. When he looked back, the snow was already burying it. By morning, only the windshield showed above white silence. In the winter of 1944-45, more than 30,000 Jeeps served on the Western Front. Many operated with snow chains, makeshift heaters, and canvas covers built from scraps. Mechanics nicknamed them snow ghosts. Even tanks depended on them for supplies. A single Jeep could reach places half-tracks could not. When Patton's Third Army broke through to relieve Bastogne on December 26th, the first vehicle into the town wasn't a tank. It was a Jeep, headlights on. An American flag lashed to its antenna, stiff with ice. The soldiers of the 101st cheered as it rolled past, not for the machine itself, but for what it meant. The line had held. The road had survived. Later that night, the sky cleared. Engines finally went quiet. The forest still smoked from battle, trees splintered like matchsticks. A single Jeep sat half-buried near a crossroads, its hood dented, grille bent, windshield cracked in two. Someone had placed a helmet on its seat, a candle inside, flickering through the glass. The wind moved around it softly, almost respectfully. Lieutenant John McKinley, combat engineer, scribbled in his notebook, "If these wheels ever stop, we stop. They're the only thing still believing we can move forward." He closed the book, tucked it into his coat, and started another engine. The winter proved something no statistic could. The Jeep wasn't built for victory parades or open highways. It was built for days when the world froze and hope turned mechanical. It endured not because it was perfect, but because men trusted it when nothing else worked. That trust was its armor. As dawn broke, light spilled over snowdrifts littered with tracks and silence. The camera pans low, across spent shell casings, torn tarps, and a half-frozen tire print leading east. Engines start one by one, faint at first, then many. The convoy begins to move again, through thawing slush toward Germany. Each Jeep carries more than soldiers now. They carry what winter couldn't kill, persistence. In that frozen forest, courage didn't roar. It sputtered, it rattled, it coughed smoke through ice, and it kept moving. The Jeep was the sound of defiance made mechanical, and its echo would follow the armies into the heart of a broken empire. Engines fade beneath a rising wind. Snow turns to rain. The white forest becomes gray rubble. Germany, spring 1945. Rain fell over stone. Cities unrecognizable. Streets turned to rivers of mud and brick. Engines idled among collapsed facades, echoing off hollow walls. The Jeep, once new, once proud, now bore the scars of every mile. Fenders bent, paint burned dull, canvas patched with rags and tape, yet it moved. Everywhere the front advanced, it was there first. Reconnaissance, medics, supply, surrender. The same four wheels for every duty, every burden. April 1945. The Rhine had been crossed. The Reich was breaking apart. And behind the armored columns, the smaller machines did the quiet work of ending a war. Drivers leaned forward, coats soaked, helmets glistening. Their faces unreadable, tired beyond expression. Each Jeep carried more silence than words. The drone of engines merged with church bells, cracked, uneven, echoing through smoke. They drove through villages half in flame, half in rain. Windows shattered, curtains flapping in the wind. Children stood in doorways, eyes wide at the sight of stars and stripes painted on gray machines. One soldier stopped, climbed out, and handed a girl his chocolate ration. She took it without speaking. The Jeep idled beside them, its engine ticking like a clock that would not stop keeping time. By April 1945, the Allies had over 150,000 Jeeps operating across Europe. They formed nearly one-third of all light transport on the Western Front. Their average lifespan at the front, only 3 months. Most died on the road they made possible. Factories back home could not keep up. Trains arrived daily, unloading fresh frames into ruined depots. Each one vanished into dust within weeks. Engineers from Willys and Ford traveled with the Armies, recording field repairs. Their notes filled with admiration and disbelief. One wrote, "We designed it for 2 years of life. They made it immortal by refusing to stop." In the wreckage of Cologne, 2 Jeeps stood side by side, one American, one British, both caked in gray ash. Their windshields were down, their radios still crackling faintly. A crow perched on a broken mirror. Smoke rose behind them like memory. This was not victory. It was the mechanical rhythm of exhaustion. Private Ernest Cole found an abandoned German cart and hitched it behind his Jeep. He scrawled in chalk across the backboard, "For the ones walking home." When villagers saw it, they waved him through without words. Later, in his letter home, he wrote, "I think mercy runs on 4 wheels, too." As the war neared its end, the Jeep ceased to be a weapon. It became a witness. It crossed battle lines, surrendered towns, and ferried doctors into camps where silence lived heavier than gunfire. The same engine that once carried soldiers into battle now carried nurses through the gates of Buchenwald. The same tires that once tore through sand now rolled over ashes. At Dachau, a convoy of Jeeps arrived before the cameras. The soldiers stepped out, covered, their mouths, and stared. Engines idled, reluctant to stop, as if the sound itself could drown what the eyes refused to believe. One driver shut his off. For the first time in years, there was complete silence. They said it was a machine of war, but it ended its journey carrying the living through the ruins of what mankind had done to itself. Its engine was the last heartbeat of a generation that had seen too much. The rain quieted. Engines faded one by one until only one remained, idling softly beneath dripping eaves. The shot widened. Hundreds of Jeeps parked in rows, headlights dim, a sea of gray metal under a pale spring sky. Then silence. The war in Europe was over. Engines echoed one last time across the docks of Antwerp and Le Havre. Ships stood waiting, cranes swaying in the wind. Rows of Jeeps lined the quays, mud still clinging to their tires, names still scrawled on their hoods. Some were dented beyond repair, others gleamed after a soldier's final polish. Each one told the same story, of roads found and friends left behind. The war was over, but the machines were not yet done moving. Steam hissed through cargo holds. Chains groaned. Jeeps were lifted from steel decks back to the land that built them. Some would be sold, some scrapped. Some would find their way to farms, fire departments, and forgotten dirt roads. A few soldiers bought theirs for $1, the price of memory. They drove them home past waving neighbors and silent fields. In every state, the same sound returned, that low, steady hum of pistons and faith. Farmers plowed fields with them. Ranchers hauled fence wire. Children climbed the seats and asked their fathers where it had been, and the fathers paused, because there were no words that could hold all those miles. Between 1945 and 1946, over 100,000 surplus Jeeps were shipped back to the United States. Thousands more were gifted to allied nations through the Lend-Lease Return program. Others stayed overseas, rebuilt by civilians from scrap and hope. The war's most versatile weapon had become its most useful survivor. Factories that once echoed with assembly now hummed with peace. Willys Overland turned from khaki to chrome, painting its first civilian model. The CJ-2A marked the Jeep for the farm and the family. Advertisements showed smiling workers instead of soldiers, the same shape, a new promise. But in quiet corners of those factories, older men paused when the engines tested. For them, the sound meant something else. One engineer said softly, "That's the sound of the boys who didn't make it home." In Kansas, a veteran named Howard Mills drove his Jeep to Sunday service every week. He never painted over the faded white star on its hood. When asked why, he said, "It's not decoration. It's a reminder that we kept moving." He would park it under the same oak tree until the day he died. Grainy film, 1946 parade. Jeeps roll past cheering crowds, flags fluttering, bands playing. Children wave. The veterans wave back, smiling, but their eyes look somewhere else, toward places the music can't reach. The Jeep hums beneath them, steady as ever, unchanged, unshaken. Peace had new roads, but the same heart. The Jeep, born of war, became a messenger of endurance. Its shape carried memory across generations, across continents. Wherever it went, people recognized that sound, the sound of movement, of progress, of something small that refused to quit. In Europe, surplus Jeeps cleared rubble from London, Warsaw, and Rome. In Asia, they rebuilt airstrips and carried medicine to villages far from maps. Some still bore bullet scars. None asked to rest. It was said that wherever peace began, a Jeep had passed there first. Wind through open fields. A single Jeep drives down a country road, post-war America, late afternoon. Tall grass bends in its wake, sunlight flashing off the hood. The driver wears no uniform now, just a hat, a tired smile. He reaches out to touch the dash, the same dash that once shook under fire, and exhales. The road stretches ahead. No destination, just the hum of something familiar, faithful, free. They built it to carry armies. It carried generations instead. From war to work, from fear to peace, it kept its promise, because even when the battles ended, the road never did. The countryside fades into ocean wind, gulls crying overhead. A ship's whistle blows, a new era calling. The camera pans toward the rising sun over the Pacific. The war had ended in Europe, but across the Pacific, engines still echoed through coral and ash. From Okinawa to the Philippines, from Iwo Jima to the jungles of Burma, the same small vehicle wove between ruins, clearing what war had left behind. The ocean was quiet now, but the islands still smoked. Okinawa, August 1945. Rain fell steady, softening the blackened soil. A Jeep wound through what had been a ridge, now a graveyard of steel. Its tires crushed empty shell casings, twisted helmets, palm fronds turned gray by soot. In the passenger seat sat a medic with a clipboard and a prayer. Every few yards, he climbed out to mark a shallow mound. He never turned the engine off. He said the silence felt heavier than death. By the end of the Pacific Campaign, over 50,000 Jeeps served across the islands. They carried supplies, engineers, priests, translators, and survivors. Many were stripped down, refitted with wire mesh against shrapnel, or turned into field ambulances. No other machine reached as many battlefields. or left as many still standing. On Leyte, a Japanese farmer approached a U.S. Jeep convoy in silence. He carried a white flag made from a child's bedsheet. The driver stopped, stepped out, and bowed first. Then he handed the man a canteen of water. The Jeep idled between them, neither enemy nor victor, just the sound of something human surviving the noise. Waves lapped, then distant hammering of wood. In the months that followed Japan's surrender, the Jeeps didn't go home. They built roads, hauled lumber, cleared mines, and ferried children to reopen schools. In Tokyo, 1946, U.S. engineers painted over faded stars and stenciled new words: Civil Reconstruction Service. The same chassis, the same heartbeat, a different purpose. At a naval dockyard in Yokosuka, a young sailor carved his initials into the dash of a Jeep before it was handed to the Japanese Red Cross. He said, "If they ever drive it far enough, maybe they'll find peace too." Years later, that same vehicle would appear in photographs of post-war relief convoys, still running, still carrying supplies to villages among the mountains. The Jeep had outlived its own war. It crossed from conquest into compassion, from frontline to lifeline. Its journey no longer marked territory. It restored it. Its sound, once followed by gunfire, was now followed by laughter and rebuilding. Some machines are made to end things. This one had learned how to begin again. Dusk at a Pacific airstrip, engines idle under pink light, palm leaves flickering in the breeze. A soldier leans against his Jeep, staring at the horizon. A transport plane rises into the sky, heading east. He stays behind, his war not quite over. He watches the contrail fade, touches the hood, and whispers something no one hears. The Jeep's engine hums back, like an answer. By 1947, Jeeps were in service across more than 100 countries. They became symbols of recovery, part of the UNRWA and Marshall Plan convoys that stitched the post-war world together. In Greece, they carried doctors through ruined villages. In Korea, they mapped new borders. In the Philippines, they became jeepneys, brightly painted buses that carried hope instead of ammunition. The sound that once meant invasion now meant life returning to motion. A slow fade from tropical wind to city traffic. The hum of peacetime. Factories hum again in America. Men in suits shake hands where soldiers once saluted. The same assembly lines now build for farmers, families, and frontier roads. The camera glides past blueprints and photographs, the faces of those who built, drove, and repaired the little machine that would not die. In the Pacific, the Jeep found its final duty, not to carry armies, but to carry the world back to itself. It was no longer an instrument of war, but the memory of endurance. Steel proof that even after fire, motion could mean mercy. The low thrum of engines shifts to wind over open plains. The frame brightens, sunrise over a new decade. Sunrise over Toledo, Ohio. The same brick factory that once forged wartime steel now glowed with civilian paint. Assembly lines hummed again, lighter now, but still precise, still faithful. Engines rolled from the belts, polished and proud, carrying names that once lived only in code: CJ-2A, CJ-3B, civilian Jeep. Men who once wore uniforms now tightened bolts and overalls. They no longer counted production for the Army. They counted it for families, farms, and the open road. Outside, a new billboard gleamed in morning light. The sun never sets on the Jeep. It wasn't advertising, it was prophecy. By 1948, Willys had sold more than 200,000 civilian Jeeps across the world. The same vehicle that carried soldiers now pulled plows, ambulances, survey teams, and explorers. In remote countries, they became lifelines, the first vehicles to reach villages untouched by highways. South Korea, early 1950s. A storm built over rice fields as a lone Jeep ground through the mud. In the back, children huddled beneath blankets. A medic guided the wheel, face streaked with rain. War again, in a new land. But the vehicle beneath him was older, familiar. A ghost of another war returning to service. The same hum, the same endurance, the same stubborn will to move forward. Wind shifted, Engines echoed through decades. Vietnam, Lebanon, Somalia, Kosovo. Everywhere human conflict reached, that sound followed, a small proof that the world had learned to trust the same simple design born from 49 days of desperation. In 1969, an American engineer visited an orphanage in U. He found an old Willys Jeep there, engine cracked, tires worn smooth. The children had painted it with flowers and chalk. Hope Wagon. He asked the caretaker if it still ran. She smiled, turned the key, and the little engine coughed once, then started. He stood there weeping in the rain. The Jeep was no longer an American invention. It had become a language of survival, a design of humanity itself. Each generation rebuilt it, renamed it, and still called it friend. Through war and wilderness, from deserts to cities, it carried what mattered most: people and purpose. Its shape changed, but its soul did not. The 1970s brought chrome, comfort, and color. The 90s brought computers and airbags. Yet, under every new shell, the same heart turned. Mechanics still use the same word to describe it: dependable. Farmers still use the same phrase. It just keeps going. Every Jeep on every continent carried a trace of that first bolt tightened by hand in 1940. A whisper from Bantam, from Willys, from Ford. A machine built for need, remembered for endurance. In the 21st century, historians estimated that more than 16 million vehicles around the world trace their lineage to the original Willys MB. Its DNA survives in every compact 4x4, military or civilian, from mountain patrols to family driveways. A single idea: 4 wheels, 4 gears, and faith in motion reshaped how humanity travels and rebuilds. Traffic merges into wind. Wind fades into silence. A black and white montage fills the frame. Factory workers waving from the 1940s. Soldiers saluting in the 1950s. Farmers, explorers, families, and rescuers across decades. The sound of the engine threads them together, a heartbeat steady and clear. They laughed at it once. Too small, too simple, too late. But simplicity was its genius, and humility its power. It carried armies, and then it carried the world. It crossed deserts, jungles, and years, until the only front left was memory. The camera moves low. A single vintage Jeep parked in a museum hangar. Dust motes drift in afternoon light. A curator turns the key. The engine catches. Same sound, same breath. A child watching asks, "Is it real?" The curator smiles. Yes, still. They built it to survive war. It survived history. Because some machines are more than steel. They are motion-made memory. The idle fades into quiet wind across open plains. The sky brightens, soft, endless. Only one faint echo remains, the hum of 4 wheels moving somewhere just beyond the horizon. Wind over open plains. Distant thunder rolls, not of war, but of worst of weather. The camera glides low over endless fields, following a single narrow track carved into the earth. Dust rises gently, caught in morning light. Somewhere ahead, a faint engine hums, steady, familiar, unhurried. The war is decades gone, but the sound remains. You can hear it at veterans' gatherings, at parades, at small-town fairs. A rusted Jeep drives by, flag snapping behind it. Children wave. The old men watch in silence, hands raised, eyes far away. They remember when that sound meant movement, hope, survival. Now it means memory itself. Fewer than 3,000 original Willys MBs survive today in working condition. Each restored one is a time capsule, gears whispering of 1941, steel still carrying the fingerprints of its builders. Collectors speak of reverence, not ownership. Every bolt, they say, feels alive with history. In a quiet barn in Pennsylvania, a man in his 70s turns a wrench slowly, tightening the same bolt his father once did before shipping overseas. The smell of oil, dust, and hay fills the air. He wipes his hands, touches the hood. Beneath his fingers, faint lettering, USA 202745. He doesn't start it yet. He just listens to the silence around it, and then he says softly, "Dad said it never quit. Guess I won't either." The key turns. The engine stutters, coughs, then catches. That same note, that same heartbeat from 1940. The barn fills with sound and sunlight. Dust dances in the beams. For a moment, time bends. A veteran's granddaughter records the moment on her phone. Her caption reads, "It still runs, so does his memory." In that small gesture, 80 years of history breathe again. The Jeep's greatest legacy isn't mechanical, it is spiritual. The quiet proof that endurance, once born of war, can become a way of remembering peace. It stands as a paradox of steel, a weapon that refused to belong only to battle, a creation of destruction that learned to rebuild. Across museums and memorials, Jeeps rest beneath flags and quiet lights. But outside, in fields and mountains, they still move, their sound blending with wind and time. Each one carries the same invisible cargo, the belief that something built by hands and hope can outlast fear itself. They laughed at it once, too small for the world's biggest war, too fragile for its fury, but the road proved them wrong, because strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the hum that never stops, the steady heart that carries everything forward. Black and white photos fade one by one, soldiers smiling from a Jeep, mechanics asleep beside one, a convoy rolling through dust toward dawn. The sound of the engine lingers, then softens into silence. For those who built it, drove it, or followed its sound, freedom was never just a destination, it was the road itself.